Power can make an arrogant man feel completely invincible until he attempts to crush the wrong person. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 302 were closed, sealing in the stifling, oppressive atmosphere that Judge Thomas Grant cultivated like a prized, venomous garden. For 15 years, the Honorable Judge Grant had ruled over the municipal court with an iron gavel and a heart made of cold, unyielding stone. He was a man who thrived on the fear he instilled in others, particularly those who lacked the wealth, the voice, or the connections to fight back. His courtroom was not a sanctuary of blind justice. It was a theater of cruelty, where he played the lead role, untouchable, arrogant, and supreme. He despised the weak, and he especially despised anyone who dared to interrupt his sense of absolute authority. The golden, dying light of a Tuesday evening filtered through the high, arched windows, casting long, menacing shadows across the polished mahogany benches. In the quiet emptiness of the room, the only sound was the rhythmic, steady swish of a wet mop against the cold marble floor. Eleanor Vance, a 62-year-old black woman with silvering hair pulled back into a tight, elegant twist, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She wore the standard-issue faded blue janitor's uniform of the courthouse maintenance staff, the heavy cotton fabric worn thin at the elbows from years of seemingly invisible labor. To the arrogant men who walked these halls, she was just a shadow, a faceless worker meant to clean up the messes left behind by the powerful. But beneath her humble exterior, Eleanor carried herself with a quiet, towering dignity that radiated from her sharp, observant eyes. She worked methodically, her expression calm and unbothered, perfectly content in the silence of her task. Judge Grant sat high above her at his elevated bench, aggressively shuffling through a stack of legal documents. He was a man accustomed to absolute silence when he worked, a man who believed the very oxygen in the room belonged exclusively to him. The faint, splashing sound of Eleanor's mop ringing out into the yellow plastic bucket grated against his nerves like coarse sandpaper. He paused, his expensive fountain pen hovering over a finalized eviction notice, and glared down at the woman. His thick face, flushed with an unwarranted simmering rage, contorted into a sneer of pure disgust. How dare this lowly cleaner disrupt his concentration? He slammed his heavy hand down onto the thick wood of his desk, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the cavernous room. "You there! Stop that infernal noise this instant!" Grant barked, his voice dripping with venom and unchecked arrogance. Eleanor paused her movements, her hands resting gently on the wooden handle of the mop. She did not flinch. She did not cower. She simply looked up at him, her dark eyes steady, calm, and piercingly intelligent. It was a look that would have deeply unsettled a wiser man, a look that spoke of a profound, unshakable authority. But Thomas Grant was completely blinded by his own ego, utterly unaware that the quiet woman standing before him in a damp uniform was not a helpless victim, but a lethal predator waiting patiently in the shadows. He had just made the most colossal, devastating mistake of his entire career, and the countdown to his absolute, humiliating ruin had just begun. "Do you have cotton in your ears, woman? I said cease that racket immediately." Judge Thomas Grant's voice thundered, his face a mask of aristocratic fury. He violently pushed his heavy leather chair back and stood up, leaning over the elevated mahogany bench like a gargoyle looming over its prey. Eleanor Vance slowly straightened her back. She did not rush, nor did she display a single ounce of the fearful subservience that Grant always demanded from the working class. She calmly unhanded the wooden handle of her mop and looked directly into his eyes. "I apologize if the sound of my work disturbed you, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was remarkably smooth, deep, and unnervingly steady. "I was instructed by the head of courthouse maintenance that this specific courtroom was to be entirely sanitized by 6 o'clock this evening." Grant scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed aggressively in the empty, cavernous room. "I do not care what some blue-collar supervisor told you. I am the law here. I am the absolute authority in this courtroom. When I am working, this room belongs entirely to me. You are nothing but a minor irritation, a speck of dirt that you are supposedly paid to clean." Eleanor remained completely composed. 30 years of navigating the complex, male-dominated corridors of the highest judicial systems had made her thoroughly immune to the fragile egos of tyrannical men in black robes. She knew exactly what Grant was doing, but she maintained her undercover persona flawlessly. "I am simply performing my assigned duties, Judge Grant. If you require absolute silence, perhaps a formal schedule adjustment with the maintenance department would be appropriate." The very suggestion that he, a sitting municipal judge with a supposedly flawless record, should have to coordinate his schedule with a lowly janitor sent Grant over the absolute edge. His ego, bloated and monstrous, could not process the quiet, immovable defiance radiating from this elderly black woman. "Appropriate?" he sneered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, venomous hiss that carried across the room. "You dare lecture me on what is appropriate in my own courtroom? You clearly lack the basic intelligence to understand exactly who you are speaking to." Oh. He snatched his wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with unnecessary, violent force. "Let us see how appropriate you find this. I am officially holding you in summary contempt of court for willful disruption and blatant disrespect. I fine you $5,000, payable immediately to the municipal clerk. If you cannot pay it by tomorrow morning, you will spend the next 30 days sitting in a county jail cell. Now get out of my sight." The following morning, the atmosphere inside the municipal courthouse was thick with a frantic, nervous energy. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the grand marble lobby was buzzing with clerks, attorneys, and bailiffs moving at a rapid pace. Rumors had been swirling for weeks that the state's Judicial Oversight Committee had dispatched their most ruthless investigator, the Supreme Court inspector, to audit the county's deeply flawed legal system. Judge Thomas Grant, however, remained entirely unbothered by the impending storm. He strolled through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse with his chest puffed out, an expensive leather briefcase in one hand and a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his thick face. He felt completely invincible. As he walked past the security checkpoint, he spotted his young clerk, Arthur, nervously clutching a stack of files. "Good morning, Arthur," Grant boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I trust you filed that summary contempt citation against the cleaning woman from yesterday evening. I want her in a county jail cell the second she fails to produce that $5,000. Let it serve as a permanent reminder to the rest of the bottom feeders in this building." Arthur swallowed hard, his face pale and drawn. "Yes, Your Honor, the paperwork was filed. But, sir, there is a mandatory assembly in the main courtroom in 15 minutes. The mayor and the chief justice are here." Grant's smirk widened. He assumed this assembly was to commend his impeccable record, perhaps even announce his promotion to the appellate court. "Excellent," Grant replied, straightening his silk tie. "It is about time this city recognized true judicial excellence." He marched toward the elevators, completely blind to the fact that he was walking directly into his own professional execution. Outside, a sleek black government SUV pulled up to the steps of the courthouse. The heavy doors opened and a woman stepped out into the crisp morning air. It was Eleanor Vance. Gone was the faded, damp blue janitor's uniform. In its place, she wore a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit that radiated absolute, unquestionable authority. Her silver hair was styled flawlessly, and a gleaming gold badge rested securely in her inner breast pocket. She was flanked by two stoic men in dark suits, federal auditors from the state capitol. Eleanor adjusted her cuffs, her dark eyes locking onto the courthouse doors with the lethal focus of an apex predator. She had spent a month undercover, scrubbing floors and enduring the vile arrogance of corrupt men just to gather undeniable proof. Today was the day she burned Thomas Grant's tyrannical empire to the ground. The grand assembly room on the second floor of the municipal courthouse was packed to maximum capacity. Over 100 court clerks, bailiffs, attorneys, and sitting judges murmured in hushed, nervous tones. At the very front of the room, seated in a velvet-lined chair reserved for senior officials, Judge Thomas Grant sat with his legs crossed, projecting an air of supreme confidence. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, scanning the crowd with a condescending smirk. He was thoroughly convinced that this unprecedented mandatory assembly was called to announce his elevation to the state appellate court. After all, his conviction rates were the highest in the county, even if his methods were notoriously ruthless. Beside him, young Arthur, the court clerk, looked as though he might be sick, clutching his notepad with trembling, clammy hands. At precisely 8 a.m., the heavy wooden doors at the front of the room opened, and Mayor Richard Sterling walked briskly to the podium, followed closely by the state chief justice. The room instantly fell into a dead, heavy silence. The mayor adjusted the microphone, his expression deeply severe. "Good morning," the mayor began, his voice echoing off the high, ornate ceilings. "For the past 5 years, this courthouse has been plagued by alarming reports of corruption, civil rights violations, and a gross abuse of judicial authority. We have citizens who have been unlawfully detained, financially ruined, and stripped of their constitutional rights by the very people sworn to protect them." In the front row, Judge Grant nodded in solemn agreement, completely blind to the reality of the situation. He leaned over to a neighboring judge and whispered, "It is about time they clean out the lower courts. These younger magistrates have no discipline." "To uncover the absolute truth," the mayor continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity, cutting through the silence like a scalpel, the state's Judicial Oversight Committee authorized a highly classified, month-long undercover audit of this specific building. They sent their most decorated and ruthless investigator to observe the daily operations of this courthouse from the ground level. Today, that audit is complete. The mayor stepped aside, gesturing toward the side entrance of the stage. "I introduce to you the Supreme Court inspector, who has been walking among us unseen for the past 30 days. The side doors swung open, and the rhythmic, authoritative click of heels echoed sharply across the silent room. Out from the shadows walked Eleanor Vance. She was no longer pushing a yellow mop bucket. She was dressed in an immaculate, razor-sharp charcoal suit. A gleaming gold state inspector's badge clipped prominently to her lapel, catching the bright fluorescent lights of the auditorium. She walked to the podium with the lethal, measured grace of a predator entering a cage full of cornered prey. In the front row, Judge Thomas Grant stopped breathing. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of ash gray. His heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. The thick, arrogant smirk melted off his lips, replaced by a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. It was her, the cleaning woman, the woman he had illegally fined and threatened with jail time less than 14 hours ago. A collective gasp rippled through the packed assembly room as Eleanor Vance took her place behind the heavy wooden podium. The whispering ceased instantly, replaced by a suffocating, electrifying silence. The dozens of judges and attorneys in the audience stared in absolute disbelief, struggling to reconcile the powerful, impeccably dressed woman before them with the invisible, blue-collar worker they had ignored in the hallways for the past month. But for Judge Thomas Grant, seated in the front row, the shock was infinitely worse. It was a physical, devastating blow. The air completely vanished from his lungs. His vision blurred at the edges as his mind frantically replayed the horrific events of the previous evening. His barking orders, the heavy slam of his gavel, the malicious $5,000 fine he had levied against the highest-ranking judicial investigator in the entire state. Eleanor adjusted the microphone, her silver hair catching the bright auditorium lights. When she spoke, her voice was the exact same smooth, deep, and steady baritone that had calmly answered Grant in the empty courtroom, but now it resonated with the crushing, undeniable weight of absolute authority. "Good morning," Eleanor began, her piercing gaze sweeping over the crowd before locking directly onto Grant. He felt like a mouse caught in the unforgiving stare of a hawk. "For the past 30 days, I have scrubbed your floors. I have emptied your trash. I have walked your hallways as a ghost, observing not how you treat your wealthy peers, but how you treat those you believe are beneath you. True character, after all, is revealed in the dark when you think no one of consequence is watching." Next to Grant, young Arthur, the court clerk, slowly turned his head to look at the judge. The color drained from Arthur's face as the horrifying realization hit him. The summary contempt citation. He had personally typed it. He had handed it directly to the Supreme Court inspector. "I have witnessed profound dedication in this building," Eleanor continued, her voice echoing sharply against the mahogany walls. "But I have also witnessed a staggering, sickening abuse of power. I have seen men who view their black robes not as a solemn duty to the Constitution, but as a heavy crown to rule over a personal kingdom." She reached into the inner breast pocket of her tailored charcoal suit. The entire room held its breath. With slow, deliberate precision, she pulled out a familiar, heavily stamped piece of paper. She unfolded it and held it up for the entire assembly to see. "Last night at approximately 6:15 p.m., I was fulfilling my assigned duties in Courtroom 302, Eleanor stated, her voice slicing through the heavy tension like a scalpel. "For the fabricated crime of making a damp sound with a mop during scheduled maintenance hours, a sitting judge in this very room held me in summary contempt. He fined me $5,000 on the spot and threatened me with 30 days in a county jail cell if I did not pay it by 8 o'clock this morning." A loud murmur of shock and utter outrage erupted from the back rows of the auditorium. The state chief justice, seated on the stage behind Eleanor, darkened with visible, righteous fury. Grant gripped the armrests of his velvet chair so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, to offer some pathetic, groveling excuse, but his throat was bone dry. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own blinding arrogance, trapped perfectly in the inescapable web of his own making. The state chief justice, a man known for his unwavering integrity and zero tolerance for corruption, stood slowly from his seat on the stage. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury as he approached the podium to stand beside Eleanor. He looked down at the $5,000 summary contempt citation she was holding, his eyes scanning the completely fabricated charges and the outrageous penalty. He then turned his piercing gaze toward the front row, locking eyes with the trembling, pathetic figure of Judge Thomas Grant. "Thomas," the Chief Justice began, his voice dangerously low, vibrating through the microphone and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You fined the members of the courthouse maintenance staff $5,000 for mopping a floor during scheduled cleaning hours. You threatened a citizen of this county with 30 days in jail because the sound of her labor offended your delicate sensibilities." Grant opened his mouth, desperately gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. "Your Honor, Chief Justice, I can explain," Grant stammered, his tough, aristocratic facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces. The deep crimson flush of anger that usually dominated his face was completely gone, replaced by a sickly, terrified pallor. She was being intentionally disruptive. She was showing blatant disrespect for the court. "I made a judgment call based on my authority to maintain order. I had no idea she was an inspector." Eleanor Vance let out a short, sharp laugh that cut through Grant's pathetic excuses like a razor. She leaned into the microphone, her eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. "That is precisely the point, Thomas. You made a judgment call based on your unchecked arrogance and your deeply ingrained belief that the working class exists only to bow to you," she stated, her voice ringing out with absolute authority. "You thought I was a nobody. You thought I was a target you could crush without consequence. But this citation is just the final nail in your coffin." She gestured to the two federal auditors standing stoically at the edge of the stage. One of the men stepped forward, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He unlatched it and pulled out a massive stack of files, placing them firmly on the podium. "These are the internal affairs dossiers," Eleanor declared, placing her hand flat on the mountain of evidence. They detailed 15 years of judicial misconduct, systemic racial profiling, extortion, and the intentional ruination of innocent lives. The previous oversight committees looked the other way because you brought in high conviction numbers and generated massive revenue through exorbitant unlawful fines. But I do not care about your statistics, Thomas. I care about the Constitution, I care about the law, and I care about the people you have systematically terrorized from your elevated bench." The entire assembly room was dead silent, the weight of her words completely crushing the last remaining fragments of Judge Grant's empire. The deafening silence in the grand assembly room stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as the massive mountain of internal affairs dossiers rested on the heavy wooden podium. Judge Thomas Grant stared at the thick, heavily redacted files, his mind spinning in a frantic, desperate attempt to find a loophole, an escape route, a way to somehow spin this absolute catastrophe. He was a man who had built his entire career on relentless intimidation and leveraging corrupt political favors, and his toxic survival instinct finally kicked in. "Chief Justice, this is an orchestrated, politically motivated witch hunt." "Oh!" Grant suddenly yelled, his voice cracking with raw panic as he violently pushed himself out of his velvet chair. "You cannot simply ambush a sitting municipal judge based on the fabricated reports of disgruntled criminals and a lowly janitor. I have powerful friends in the state legislature. I demand union representation immediately." Eleanor Vance did not even blink at his pathetic, groveling outburst. She simply adjusted the cuffs of her immaculate charcoal suit and looked down at him with a cold, surgical precision that made the blood freeze in his veins. "Your political friends abandoned you at exactly 7 a.m. this morning, Thomas. The precise moment I sent digital copies of these files to the governor's office and the State Ethics Committee," Eleanor stated, her voice echoing through the auditorium with absolute, terrifying finality. "As for your union representation, they were fully briefed on your systematic extortion of public funds 30 minutes ago. They have officially declined to intervene on your behalf. You are completely and utterly alone in this room." Next to Grant, young Arthur, the terrified court clerk, scrambled out of his seat and backed away quickly, horrified at the prospect of being associated with the disgraced sinking judge. Mayor Richard Sterling stepped forward to the microphone, his face etched with profound disgust. "Judge Grant, your reckless, arrogant actions have brought profound shame to this city and to the entire judicial system," the mayor declared, his voice booming. "The hard-working citizens of this county rely on the unquestionable integrity of this court, and you have treated their lives and their freedom like a personal, twisted game." Eleanor nodded to the two federal auditors standing by the stage. "Thomas Grant," she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the razor-sharp authority of a seasoned predator executing its final strike. "By the authority vested in me by the state Supreme Court, you are hereby stripped of your judicial title, effective immediately. You are being placed under federal arrest for gross civil rights violations, extortion, and battery under the color of state law." The heavy, ornate doors of the assembly room swung open with a resounding crash, and 4 uniformed federal marshals marched briskly down the center aisle. Their expressions were stone cold, their eyes locked entirely on the disgraced judge. The collective breath of the room hitched. For a decade and a half, Thomas Grant had been the untouchable tyrant of the municipal courthouse, a man who casually ruined lives with the flick of his expensive fountain pen. Now, he was nothing more than a cornered, trembling criminal facing the absolute destruction of his entirely corrupt empire. "Hands behind your back, Mr. Grant," the lead marshal ordered, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. He completely omitted the title of judge, a deliberate and highly symbolic stripping of the power Grant had so viciously abused. Grant's legs finally gave out. He collapsed back into his velvet-lined chair, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "You cannot do this to me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch that sounded completely alien to the men and women who had only ever heard him roar in anger. "I am a man of the law. I demand to call my attorney. You have no jurisdiction here." He flailed his arms wildly as the marshals descended upon him, but his pathetic resistance was absolutely futile. They grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling his heavy frame out of the chair, and forcefully twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the dead-silent auditorium like a gunshot. It was the exact same sound hundreds of innocent citizens had heard just before being unjustly ripped away from their families under Grant's tyrannical orders. Eleanor Vance watched the violent spectacle with an expression of unwavering, terrifying calm. She did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply stood at the podium like an immovable pillar of justice, watching the scales finally balance themselves. "The law is a shield for the innocent, Thomas," Eleanor said, her deep, authoritative voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing. "You chose to use it as a weapon against the vulnerable. Today, that weapon has been permanently dismantled." As the marshals dragged the weeping, hyperventilating man down the center aisle, the hundreds of court clerks, bailiffs, and attorneys in the audience instinctively stepped back, parting like the Red Sea to let the disgraced tyrant pass. Nobody offered a single word of sympathy. Nobody tried to intervene. They simply watched in stunned, absolute awe as the Supreme Court inspector thoroughly eradicated the rot that had infected their courthouse for 15 long years. "Take this, Arthur," Eleanor commanded softly, pressing the $5,000 summary contempt citation into the young clerk's trembling hands. "Fear is a natural human response to tyranny, but cowardice is a choice. You chose to protect your own paycheck over the constitutional rights of a citizen you believed was powerless. That is exactly how systemic corruption survives, not just through the arrogance of men like Thomas Grant, but through the silent complicity of good people who look the other way." Arthur stared down at the crumpled paper, the heavy weight of his profound moral failure crushing his chest. Tears spilled over his eyelashes, dropping onto the pristine courthouse floor. "I failed," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated shame. "I failed the oath I took completely." "Yes, you did," Eleanor replied, her tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "But I have spent 30 years dismantling corrupt precincts and courtrooms, and I know the difference between a malicious predator and a terrified rookie trapped in a toxic ecosystem. You are not going to jail today, Arthur, but you are going to spend the next 6 months working directly under my federal audit team, documenting every single buried complaint, every illegal fine, and every fabricated charge Thomas Grant filed over the last 15 years. You are going to help us tear his empire down to the studs. Do you understand me?" The young clerk's head snapped up, a look of profound shock and immense relief washing over his pale face. He nodded frantically, clutching the citation to his chest like a lifeline. "Yes, Inspector. Yes, absolutely. I will not fail you again, I swear it." Eleanor turned her back on the weeping clerk, her commanding presence shifting toward the mayor and the state chief justice, who were still standing near the podium in stunned silence. The absolute surgical precision with which she had just dismantled the most feared man in the courthouse had left the entire room utterly paralyzed. "We are shutting Courtroom 302 down immediately," Eleanor declared to the Chief Justice, her voice echoing with lethal, uncompromising finality. "My federal agents will be seizing every computer, every filing cabinet, and every private communication log in Grant's chambers. I want a complete forensic accounting of every single dollar that has moved through his court in the last decade." She then slowly turned her head, her dark, piercing eyes sweeping across the rows of judges, attorneys, and the bailiffs who were still frozen in their velvet-lined seats. The heavy silence in the Grand Assembly Room was absolutely deafening. If any other official in this building has participated in his extortion racket, or if you have conveniently looked the other way while he destroyed innocent lives, Eleanor warned, her voice slicing through the tension like a razor, I strongly suggest you hand in your formal resignation before noon today. Because if you choose to stay and my audit uncovers your name in those files, I promise you, I will personally see to it that you are stripped of your pension and share a federal cell with Thomas Grant. You are all dismissed. The news of Judge Thomas Grant's spectacular downfall spread through the city like wildfire. By noon, every major news network had picked up the thrilling story of the arrogant, tyrannical judge who had unknowingly fined and threatened the state's highest-ranking judicial inspector while she was working undercover as a courthouse janitor. The absolute poetic justice of his humiliating demise captivated the public. Grant, a man who had spent a decade and a half weaponizing the law to crush the working class, was now sitting in a sterile, concrete federal holding cell, entirely stripped of his wealth, his prestige, and his seemingly untouchable power. The deep, systemic corruption he had cultivated within the municipal court was being aggressively dismantled piece by Eleanor's elite federal audit team. Dozens of wrongful convictions were swiftly overturned, heavily inflated fines were refunded to innocent citizens, and several other complicit officials quietly handed in their resignations before the federal agents could knock on their doors. The suffocating era of fear that had choked Courtroom 302 was permanently eradicated. A few weeks later, the municipal courthouse felt like an entirely different building. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere had been replaced by a renewed sense of genuine accountability and respect. Young Arthur, the court clerk, now worked with a fierce, unwavering dedication under the new interim judge, determined to honor the absolute second chance he had been given. He treated everyone who walked through the heavy oak doors, from the wealthiest corporate attorneys to the overnight maintenance staff, with the exact same level of profound dignity. He had learned the hardest lesson of his life. Character is defined by how you treat those who can do absolutely nothing for you. Miles away, in the quiet, sunlit office of the state capitol, Eleanor Vance sat behind her polished mahogany desk, meticulously reviewing a new stack of heavily redacted case files. She wore her immaculate charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back into its signature elegant twist. She had spent 30 years navigating the darkest, most corrupt corners of the justice system, and she knew her grueling work was never truly finished. Unchecked power would always attract those who sought to abuse it. But karma has a beautiful, unavoidable way of catching up to pure arrogance. True authority does not need to shout, and it certainly does not need to belittle the vulnerable citizens it swore to protect. It only needs to wait patiently in the shadows, quietly observing the truth, until the perfect moment arrives to strike. If you love this satisfying story of ultimate justice served cold, please hit the like button. Share this incredible courtroom drama with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life karma stories every single week.